Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you all very much for coming out to the last presentation of the day, which for our World War I genealogy workshop. My name is Deborah Dudak. I'm from the Fountaindale Public Library in Bolingbrook. And we always like to remind people that this wonderful program and this entire webinar, which is available for 3 years to all researchers for free, has been made possible by World War I in America, which is a 2-year national initiative from the Library of America, presented in partnership with the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and other organizations with general support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So Tina and I and all genealogy researchers from the United States would like to thank them very, very much for their very generous support. Without them, we would not be able to make this type of program possible. So the last program that I have for the day is actually with the amazing Tina Baird. She's going to be covering influenza and the Great War, which we know sounds like a little bit of a downer at the last part of our webinar today, but we're also being reminded that we also think it's very timely, because as the World War I service and the armistice is starting to kind of come to fruition, that the pandemic actually starts to come and sweep the entire globe. So going in a chronological timeline, this would be the thing that people would be thinking about as they're exiting the war from Europe and from other places around the globe. So would you all please give Tina Baird a very warm round of applause. Thank you.
So I have to show off my present. So when Deb and I gave these lectures in April at the Illinois History Symposium, I had as my moderator Dr. Larry von Bergen, and he was a retired immunologist. And he gave me this as a thank you, which is one of the original influenza signs, quarantine signs from 1918. And he says, this is what happens when you have too much money and an eBay addiction. So I get to say thank you to him for giving me this absolutely magnificent sign. So when I talk about the influenza, Deb and I like to start, you guys know I have struggled with a cold all day today. So typically when I start this lecture, I'll walk down to the crowd and I'll go, achoo! That's how it started. That's exactly how it started. So when we seem to think that, the flu was something that people were catching by, snuggling or holding hands or getting close to each other, just being in a crowded room with a group of people is exactly how that began. So don't worry, I don't have the flu. I might have fevers and a chill, but I don't have the flu. Any place somebody went, you ran the risk of being exposed, whether you were at school, whether you were on a bus, whether you were a police officer, or whether you were in the U.S. Army. You ran the risk of exposure during this very scary, horrific time. So, there are actually 3 waves to the influenza outbreak. In the very beginning, that kind of germination, so to speak, of the influenza outbreak in the U.S. began in March of 1918. So some people speculate exactly how it started, but what we know is that in early March, right about March 7th, in Haskell, Kansas, there's an outbreak recorded of a flu epidemic amongst the community. Now, research shows that there was a huge cattle and a huge pig industry going on in Haskell, Kansas at that time period. Only nobody made the connection between the sickness that was going on within the pigs and the sickness that was starting to show up amongst the humans in Haskell, Kansas. Well, Haskell, Kansas is not that far away from Camp Funston, which was a very large military base in Kansas for soldiers who were serving in the First World War. It was an induction point, so it was the first place people from, Kansas and Nebraska were coming in order to be inducted into the military. So from March 7th until about March 11th, it's a very short window. You start seeing people becoming ill at Camp Funston, which could be a direct correlation to how close they were to Haskell, Kansas. So, between March 4th and March 11th, you had over 500 soldiers who became ill with what we would consider at the end of the pandemic as being a mild case of the flu. People had bronchial issues, they had, they had lower respiratory or lower body distress, to not be gross. That number continues to climb, and it continues to climb, and it continues to climb. That by the end of March, they have 1,100 soldiers who have reported ill to the hospital at Camp Funston. Now, remember what I said about the number of beds? It could be a very big issue. Yeah. So what we see is that they're having to turn barracks into hospital wards. They're having to quarantine entire units to make sure that they're not spreading it to the rest of the camp. But because it was a more mild strain, they didn't report any deaths. You know, a lot of people became sick, a lot of people were sick for several days, and then it kind of dies down, and there aren't a lot of casualties from it. So what they began doing was they began putting them in barracks and rearranging barracks and just treating the ill. So you see the nurse here, she's got her face covered trying to protect herself from the coughing and the wheezing that's going on with this particular battle of the flu. But that very first wave, while it was concerning when you have so many soldiers come down with the same ailment at the same time, but it wasn't distressing because they weren't reporting any casualties at that point. So throughout the spring, you start to see communities all across the U.S. That's kind of the epicenter for that first wave. You know, you start to see people getting sick in Oregon and California. You start to see people getting sick in Illinois and in Alabama, and it starts spreading outward from that central location. It spreads to other bases. You know, so the men at Camp Funston weren't the only ones that were becoming ill. You know, as you're transferring men in between units and in between military bases, you start to see it popping up at other bases. And Camp Dodge, being one of the closest bases to it, starts to see a lot of men who are coming down with the flu as well. Only by the time that it starts to hit Camp Dodge in June and starting into July of that same year, something goes haywire. Something goes wrong in that flu epidemic. They call it an antigen shift, where it's no longer that same strain that people caught the first time around in March. It comes with a little tweak to it. So when this wave of the flu starts to begin at the end of June, beginning of July, just as the boys are getting ready to go overseas as members of the AEF, you start to see a spike in the number of casualties. You start to see men dying. They're in low numbers at first. You know, you might have 1,000 people who get sick at Camp Dodge, but the numbers remain low. 6 casualties, 7 casualties, a very low number of men who are actually succumbing to the flu at that time. So right as the 313th gets ready to ship overseas, several of their men come down with the flu while they're on board ship heading towards France. And once they arrive in France, less than 3 days in, it was, you know, right on the cusp of day 2 and day 3, the captain of their unit dies. Captain Bruce Honeyman actually succumbs to his flu ailment and dies in France. He's the first of that division who's actually listed as dying as an influenza victim. So that's where it starts to begin. That's where that antigen shift starts to happen. And the influenza decimates during the summer of 1918, decimates the U.S. Army, decimates the French Army, the British Army, the German Army. Something happens in June of that year that causes that break, that shift between the guys who are catching it and recovering and the guys who are catching it and who are dying. We're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers come down with the flu in the AEF, in the British Army, in the Australian Army, in the French Army, in the German Army at this time. So you figure the U.S. Army had 4 million soldiers who were serving in the U.S. military at that time. The numbers that doctors have given, Carol Byersley wrote a book about the influenza in the U.S. Army, and she estimates that number as being as high as 1 million soldiers come down with the flu. 26% is her estimate as the number of soldiers in that fall between June and September that catch the flu, whether they're soldiers in the AEF serving in France or those soldiers who are being allowed to go home and they're boarding those ships and they're bringing that flu back to the U.S. So that's a staggering number when you think about it. 26% of U.S. soldiers come down with the flu. That doesn't include the hundreds of thousands of British soldiers, of German soldiers. So when you have that many people laid up sick, how do you form supply groups? How are you getting food and ammunition and uniforms to the men in the trenches when 25% of your staff are ill? And the same is true for the German army. You know, how are the Germans managing to fight considering that, they've got the same number estimated as being sick in their own ranks as well. They've given estimates as high as 40%. I have a tendency to believe what Carol Byersley says because she used a lot of primary resources in her research. She's a doctor as well, an immunologist. So even if you lowball it at 25%, you're looking at millions of men. If you go as high as 40%, like she's estimating, then you're dealing with close to 1.5 million, 2 million people who are coming down ill, all within a 3-month span. So remember when I mentioned casualty reports earlier, and how on earth can you figure out in a casualty report whether or not your guy is going to show up in there? I just pulled a random sample. When you've got 1 million records to choose from because 1 million men come down with the flu, I took a representative sample, right? It gives the name of the unit. These are records that come from the severely wounded and casualty records of the AEF, right? 314th, a lot of these are 314th, right? Labor Battalion, Labor Battalion, Labor Battalion, CC 275, CC 276, CC 275, Casualty Cablegram 275. Remember I said that they would have separate pages for killed in action, wounded in action. They had a page specifically for influenza victims. So we can kind of drill into this data. Not everybody dies, but they're going to the hospital. They're being diagnosed. So they're showing up as a casualty because they can't be at the front when they're sick. They're in the hospital. They've been quarantined. They're being held back. So in these instances, all of these men did die of disease, and they died of pneumonia and of flu. And it tells me exactly where. It tells me what they were qualified to receive because of it. So these records do exist. So if you suspect that your ancestor who served in the First World War, who may have come home and who may have, lived for a number of years after the war, there are ways to find out if he was one of these flu victims by going through these casualty reports or going through these casualty cablegrams. The influenza boomeranged, so to speak. So you have that antigen shift that starts in June, that by the time you've got troops returning home in August of 1917, that strain becomes something unrecognizable from the strain as it was originally conceived in March of 1918. So by August of 1918, you have U.S. troops returning home from the front. The very first instance of a newspaper report of men dying of the flu is in August of 1917. And in August of 1917, they claim that an ocean liner returning with U.S. soldiers returns with 4 men who die on board of the influenza. They've actually given the cause of death in this particular instance. Says that there were reported of 21 cases of the flu that were among the passengers and crew. So you might think 4 dying isn't that big of a number, but when you think about 4 dying out of 23 cases, that's a pretty high number of people who are coming down and who are dying of this. The first camp to report this new disease is Camp Devens. Camp Devens in Massachusetts is hit hard, and they are hit harder than almost any other camp in the United States. And the reason being is because when this boat docks, the very first instance within the community, within the citizenry of people becoming ill is at Boston Harbor. And Boston Harbor is not that far away from Camp Devens in Massachusetts. It's about 35 miles outside of Boston. So this flu strain is unlike any other in the fact that the mortality rate is 25 times higher than your average flu mortality rate that you would have in any given year. So how many of us get our flu shots, right? So on the average, you might have 0.7% of the population who dies of influenza or complications from influenza. In this particular year, it was 2.5%. And a lot of people think, oh, it's a tiny number, it's inconsequential. But 2.5% of a population that has, 25 million people. That's a lot of people that they have to now bury, they have to quarantine, they have to treat, they have to diagnose, they have to go through all of that. Nobody is safe. It doesn't matter whether you are President of the United States or whether you are the local school teacher. Everybody was susceptible to this disease, from President Wilson to Assistant Secretary of the Navy, FDR. They both contract the flu. And if any of you are World War I fanatics like I am, there's a lot of speculation to the reason why President Wilson gave so many concessions at the end of the war during the peace treaty negotiation is because he hadn't recovered from the flu yet, and he just wanted to go home. Like, he really wasn't in his right mind. You know, he was still weak from the flu, and he still wasn't necessarily up to par with what was going on around him. So there are some people who speculate that him coming down with the flu is why so many concessions were made at the end of the war. Other people who came down with the flu, it didn't matter if you were rich or poor. You know, ambulance driver, 16-year-old ambulance driver, Walt Disney comes down with the flu and survives and recovered. You get actresses and actors. Mary Pickford comes down with the flu. Who knows who Bess Wallace is? Bess Wallace becomes Bess Truman, right? Harry writes letters about how he himself comes down with the flu while he's stationed in camp before they leave to go overseas. She comes down with the flu as well. And in his letters in the Presidential Library, he talks about the men in his unit who have come down sick with the flu. So, you know, there's interesting documentation there from a future president about what it was like to catch it and then recover from it. It took a tremendous toll on life to the effect that so many people died and so many people got sick from this that the average life expectancy dropped 12 years. That's a startling number. Well, one, when you think about the fact that the average life expectancy was only 51, which is now what is our average life expectancy? It's in the 70s, right? Drops from 51 to 39. That is a staggering drop because it's not affecting just the young and old. Like, we're used to seeing the influenza. It affects those with weak immune systems. It affects those who are elderly. It affects those who are very young. This flu is something unlike anything we have ever seen before in the history of pandemics. So you would typically see a line like this, you know, where the young and the healthy are managing to come down with it, but they are able to fight it. In 1918, who's it targeting? It's targeting the young and the healthy. It's targeting those between the ages of 20 and 45. So those people who normally have the abilities in the immune systems to be able to fight off infection are the people that it's killing, and the people that it's killing at the highest numbers, and the people that it's killing the quickest. There are instances, there are reports of people who come down with that flu that day who expire from it. You know, for others, it could be 24 hours, it could be 18 hours, it could be 36 hours. But if it's going to kill you, it's going to kill you very, very quickly. So Jeffrey Tonnenberger, who wrote a number of great articles about the flu, wrote this article called The Mother of All Pandemics, and I give you that link if you want to read it. It's very technical because it's written from a medical perspective. But he talks about the case fatality rate, right? He gives you these examples. So yes, we had a flu epidemic that came after that. And you look at the fatality rates and look at how low they managed to stay until you get to the very old. Because remember, the life expectancy is only 51. So if you're living into your 70s, you're well past the average life expectancy rate. But when you look at this particular strain of the flu, you know, the number of people who it's going after is unprecedented. And they don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to fight it. They don't know how to protect people from it. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of intentional, misinformation that's being sent out as a way to keep people from panicking. What's the nation prone to do? They're prone to panic, right? When you see you're young and you're healthy and your servicemen, your heroes, coming down and their lungs are dissolving, and they're dying at rapid numbers, you're going to panic. So there are instances, which I'll talk about in a little while, where they intentionally try to deceive the public so that they don't panic. And we can decide whether or not we think that is a good idea. So Camp Devens, which is just 35 miles outside of Boston, becomes ground zero, really, for the influenza outbreak in the United States. You do see it crop up in other places around that same time, but Camp Devens is really the place that takes the brunt of this. So the first soldier comes into the hospital on September 7th. He's misdiagnosed because his symptoms aren't like your standard flu symptoms. So they think that he's caught something completely different. So they put him in the general hospital, in general quarters. They don't quarantine him because they don't realize that they have to. The next day, a few more men come, and the next day, a few more men come. And there starts to become this murmur throughout the camp that there's something going on, but they don't know what it is. And they don't want to call it, a pandemic. They think it might be some new strain of some new disease that they've never seen before because They can't diagnose it as a typical flu strain. You know, you just get a couple men here and there, and then boom, on September 22nd alone, 1,500 men show up at the hospital because they're showing symptoms of the flu. Think of that number. A hospital, a base that's equipped to handle 1,200 men. You know, it's a big base. That's a lot of beds that the hospital has. Has 1,500 men who report on a single day. That number is, you know, unimaginable. You know, imagine you're at the base hospital register and your job is to, you know, write in everybody as they're coming through the door, right? How do you keep up with that? They had 25 doctors on staff. How do 25 doctors deal with 1,500 men? So what they do is they start calling in as much help as they can get. They're trying to call in medical staff from other bases, from other hospitals in the Boston area. They go to the Red Cross and they send, please, send us your doctors and send us your nurses, because we cannot handle this many people all at once. But here's where the problem in that lies. The vast majority of doctors that would have been in the Boston General Hospital at that time, a lot of them were off at the war serving. So they didn't have enough doctors to treat the patients that they had at the Boston City Hospital, let alone to spare a number of doctors in order to send them to Camp Devens to help fight the pandemic. You know, 12 nurses are sent from the Red Cross, right? 8 of those nurses become sick. When you only have 4 nurses that remain healthy, and then 2 of them die, including Margaret Sullivan, you know, how can you handle that? You know, they had numerous doctors who became ill. So then you're down, you don't have enough hands. 25 isn't enough for 1,500 people, let alone 17. So bodies start piling up. People are dying at a very rapid rate. So at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., in College Park, you know, in the file for Camp Devens, there's this little note written on hand, a scrap sheet of paper, and it's from the commanding officers, will expedite the shipment of bodies in every possible way. They can't keep up. They're trying to take care of bodies and ship bodies out as quickly as they can back to the homes of the, you know, the next of kin and the descendants of those who have succumbed to the flu. But even the morgue can't keep up. And you'll see this over and over and over, that they have to bring in trucks, that they have to bring in freezer trucks, that they have to do the best they can, you know, to take care of the bodies as well as take care of the soldiers who are reporting ill at the same time. So by the beginning of October, you know, you've got up to 100 men dying a day. You know, how does a coroner, you know, how do undertakers, how do, you know, railroad car transport staff handle 100 bodies a day that need to be sent to other places? The numbers are just absolutely staggering. You know, so what they do is they send their experts. Colonel William Welch, who had dealt with pandemics in Panama and in the Caribbean, who's an expert on kind of immunology and on communicable diseases, he gets sent. Victor Vaughn, who is another doctor, doctors from Johns Hopkins, Rufus Cole, all go up to investigate what is going on at Camp Devens. And Welch is so shocked at what he sees, he actually has to turn his back and walk out, because in his entire career, he has never seen anything like this. So he fears that there's this new strain of some disease that they don't know how to handle because they've never seen it before. So he's quoted as saying, blood was everywhere, on linens, on clothes, pouring out of some men's nostrils, even their ears, while others coughed it up. Many of the soldiers' boys in their teens, men in their 20s, healthy, normally ruddy men, were turning blue. They were suffocating. Their color would prove a deadly indicator. So as they're doing the autopsies, and some of the autopsy reports actually show up in the medical records for Camp Devens, you know, they're talking about how when they're doing their autopsies, I apologize to be gross, as they're doing their autopsies and they're opening up the lungs to take a look at them, the lungs have just exploded. That the blood vessels that within the lungs have all just burst from this potential virus. And, you know, Dr. Welch, Colonel Welch, is just horrified at the fact that they have absolutely no idea how to stop it. So they put their best doctors on it. There are men who go into the lab, the Army laboratories, and don't come out for a year, whose job it is to figure out exactly what this is, how has this happened, and how do we fight it. But they're using equipment and they're using data from the 1880s. They're thinking that this is the same flu epidemic as the one that struck France in the 1880s, and this is how they're going to deal with it. Not realizing that an antigen shift can happen and that that strain is no longer going to be the same as what they saw historically. But what they begin to notice is that people who have had the flu won't necessarily catch the same strain of flu again. So you'll have some people who got sick in March who get sick all over again in the fall, which isn't technically supposed to happen. Once you get it, you're supposed to be immune to it. So that's how they start to realize that there's something not right, that something has turned and something has changed. So that's the Army response. What about in the cities? What about in the towns? How are people dealing with this? Philadelphia is completely overwhelmed. They have absolutely no idea what to do or how to handle it, and they don't have the resources, they don't have the supplies, they don't have the expertise on how to deal with the thousands of people who are now being diagnosed with the flu within their communities. The Philadelphia newspapers, day after day after day, for 6 weeks, are reporting on the staggering numbers of people who are coming down with the disease, as well as the number of people who are succumbing to it. And you might say that Philadelphia brought it upon itself, because when the flu outbreak happens and they're seeing what's going on in Boston and they're being warned to eliminate public gatherings, don't be around other people who you think may be ill, Philadelphia ignored all of that. They had a parade where they were trying to raise money for the war effort. So they had a military bond parade, and they brought in famous celebrities to come and encourage people to buy war bonds. And they held it right downtown, right at the time that the flu outbreak is starting to hit Philadelphia. They say roughly 200,000 people showed up for the parade. Roughly 200,000 cases of people come down with the flu in Philadelphia. They take to the streets to celebrate, and within 72 hours, nearly everybody who was a part of this parade winds up coming down with the flu. So within 1 month in Philadelphia alone, you have over 12,000 people who are dead from the flu. Let that number sink in for a second. That is a humongous number. Think about the logistics of that. How do you handle them? How do you bury them? How do you protect the people who are living? How do you protect the people whose job it is to transport those bodies and keep them from getting sick, right? In the paper, day after day, 759 people perish from the epidemic. 1 day. That's just 1 day, the number of people who are passing away. So what does Philadelphia do? They have no idea what to do. They start digging mass graves, and they start burying them in mass graves to just get the body count under control. And there's a great quote that Alfred Crosby keeps in his book. And he says, at the city morgue, bodies were piled 3 and 4 deep in the corridors and in almost every single room. They're covered, the blankets are dirt and blood stained. They're unembalmed because they don't have the time to get them all embalmed. They're not being put on ice. So what happens when your body is just left out? They begin to putrefy and they begin to smell. And they said that there's a report of they had left the doors open to the coroner's office because the stench was so horrible for the people working inside that anybody walking down the street was subjected to not only the smell, but the bodies stacked high on full view for anybody who wanders by. And they tell the story about how a young boy wanders in, and sees this, and his dad grabs him and runs off to get him away from it. So the University of Pennsylvania has done an amazing job of putting a collection together of newspaper articles, first-person accounts, books, and other documents that represent what was going on in Philadelphia at the time. So if you have the ability to go to this website and take a look, it's really fascinating to see how a city can just collapse under the pressure. And because we're being filmed, I won't go into whether or not there were underground connections in Philadelphia or Chicago that were keeping business from running as usual. But there's a lot of speculation that the mob played a part in trying to help out as best they could, versus those officials who just panicked and didn't know what to do. So now what about here? We acted fairly quickly. We might not have acted appropriately, but we acted fairly quickly. So as soon as news starts breaking in September that we've got a pandemic on our hands on the East Coast, Governor Loudon acts right away. And he forms the Illinois Influenza Advisory Commission, which unfortunately at the state archives, they don't have records of this commission any longer. There are mentions of it in his personal papers, which are at the Illinois State Archives, but not the commission itself. He requires that all cities and counties report their flu totals to the appropriate committee. That can be good and that could be bad. It's kind of like you watch TV and they talk about credit monitoring versus, credit protection. That's all they're doing is they're monitoring. They're not doing anything else to warn people or protect people. So by the next day, he finally realizes that we need to do more than just monitor the number of people who are becoming ill. So he orders the closing of all public assemblages, all public buildings, public schools, banks, theaters, whatever it happens to be, close them all down. He makes an exception for churches. So churches who are willing to meet outside can still meet, as long as they're not in an enclosed space. And there are several towns that still do that. My town in Plainfield continues to do that. But he's ordering people to stay home. And that's starting to convey itself in newspapers. People are starting to be worried. They're starting to panic. They're starting to realize that if I'm in a group of people, I'm going to run the risk of coming down with this illness. So the Illinois Health Department puts out annual reports every year. And in the annual report for 1919, there's a couple things in these 2 pages that kind of amuse me. So they talk about the total number of deaths and complications from pneumonia amounted to about 32,000 compared with 103 total number of deaths throughout the state for everything else. So people get hit by cars, people die of cancer. So that number is 32,000 compared to 103,000 of people who die of other diseases. But look at the number of cases that they're reporting. It says while over 200,000 cases were reported, it represents only a small portion of the total instance of the disease. It's not being effectively reported. It's estimated that there were over 200,000 cases of the city of Chicago alone, let alone the entire state of Illinois. So that number is ridiculously low compared to what the potential totals were. So how do you know what the actual sick rate is? Because if you read the local newspapers, what are they telling you? They're telling you everybody's sick, right? Because what sells newspapers? Sensationalism sells newspapers. So you're going to jack that number up to make it, so you sell more papers than the next guy. And then you have governmental bodies who intentionally lowball the number of people that they have sick. The U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army are lowballing the numbers that they're reporting to headquarters because they don't want the enemy to know that they're not running at full staff. So they're intentionally lowballing their numbers. So that estimate of 200,000 is an absolute joke because, whether you believe the newspapers or whether you believe what's being reported by the government, the numbers aren't adding up. But they single out one guy in their report. This is the entire health report for the entire year, right? And they talk about this one guy. They talk about Great Lakes, and I'll get into that in a minute. But then they say that in the southern part of the state, in Alexander County, there's a man, who comes down with the flu, right? He's not feeling well. He comes home, decides that he's discharged from the Army, and decides he's going to go visit his girlfriend in Cache County, Illinois, and winds up giving the disease to like 535 people. So if you continue to read it, it talks about, if you read the rest of the report, it says that not only does he give it to his girlfriend, who then gives it, it spreads throughout the entire town. So they single out this one guy in Illinois as kind of being like the, typhoid Mary of Southern Illinois, who brings the flu with him from the Army and then gives it to a bunch of people in Southern Illinois. It's felt in every community. There's not a single community around the globe like we saw. There are reports from Norway to New Zealand. There are reports from Alaska, to Argentina. People are coming down with the flu. And it's being reported on in every community. Every community is touched, whether you're a big city or whether you're a little tiny community, farming community. So just around Illinois, you had papers reporting on what was going on. Whitaker dies Thursday at Great Lakes. This is from Springfield. He was a well-known Springfield boy, joins the military, goes into the Navy, is up at Great Lakes because he's there for his training, winds up contracting the influenza and dies. I showed you this one earlier about Camp Grant, right? Influenza rages in Mount Carmel. This web link right down here for EIU, they put together a really nice dissertation that somebody did comparing two communities, comparing Mount Carmel to I'm drawing a blank, I apologize, I can't remember the other community now off the top of my head, but about the vastly different newspaper reports of what's going on at the same time. Mount Carmel was very proactive and warned people, people are dying, you need to stay indoors. And then you read the other accounts from the other paper and they're like, it's all right, just make sure that, you spray your throat and that, so vastly different accounts. This one is really interesting. This comes from the Jewish newspaper in Chicago. So the Jewish newspaper reported on the Sentinel, reported across the entire United States. So in this Chicago paper, they're reporting on a guy who lives in Lima, Ohio. And he used to live in Chicago, but he's gone back home now. And it talks about how he caught the flu and wound up dying from it. So you're getting reports, like I said, you could have up to 5 or 6 different entry points to get at information about the flu through newspapers, through the camp papers, through the local papers, and through the hometown papers. This is for Will County. This is the death register for Will County for 1918. And I took the names out, but you can see influenza, 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 pneumonia, pneumonia, and the number of people who are dying. And these aren't people, these aren't babies, these aren't the elderly. These are people who are young, these are people who are healthy, these are people who should be able to fight off that disease. So nobody is remaining untouched from this. And where I work in Plainfield, you had 42 people who were buried in Plainfield Township Cemetery over the course of the year. And 12 of them were flu victims. And you might think, oh, that's not a big number. But that's 30% of people. When they're telling you that nationally the death toll is about 2.5%, and yet in your community you're seeing 30% of your burials being flu victims, that's a giant red flag. That the numbers being reported and the actual numbers aren't necessarily the same thing. Only 2 of them were outside of that 20 to 45 age bracket. And they were both elderly people. There were no children who died in Plainfield. Plainfield did its best. It mostly followed the rules. It did its best to comply with what Governor Loudon was saying. They still continued to hold their worship services, but they canceled schools, they canceled activities, they canceled parades, but it wasn't enough. In Plainfield alone, they lost 2 people, 2 veterans, 2 servicemen out of 100, so there's your 2.5%, who wound up dying of the flu. So you had Varley Pennington, who actually went AWOL from Camp Grant to try to avoid the flu because Camp Grant couldn't keep up with the number of people who were ill. And he came home, wound up catching the flu and dying at home. And then you have Sherman Matter, who was stationed at Great Lakes Naval Base, had only been there for a couple of months, wound up contracting the flu during his training, and wound up passing away. What I want to go back to is right here. I don't know if you guys can read that. Dr. Owens is reported on the sick list. He's been out so much of late attending to his practice that he suffered a breakdown. He didn't come down with the flu. He had a breakdown. And thousands of doctors across the country suffered the same breakdowns. So in medical journals, whether it's the New England Journal of Medicine, which dates back this far, or whether you're dealing with nursing association books or hospital guides, not only are they dying of pneumonia, are doctors dying at pneumonia at a staggering rate, but you see a lot of suicides. You see a lot of doctors and a lot of healthcare staff who take their own life from the strain and the stress of trying to combat this disease. So many people were serving in the armed forces. You have Captain Lorenzo Burroughs as an example, who are catching it from the military service. But you had so many people who were serving in the military that there weren't enough people here to help fight the disease on the home front. So those doctors that remained had a much higher, rate of catching the flu because they had to work. They couldn't back off and say, no, I'm going to let somebody else do this. They were the only people as the frontline defense from protecting the citizenry from this spreading any further. So, there are just hundreds of doctors that show up in these reports. And it gives you nice little biographies of who they were and how important they were and how they fought to protect people from this disease. But what's startling is the number of mental breakdowns and suicides. So keep that in mind also when you're looking at flu records, or whether you have somebody, who is a medical professional who dies during that time. Don't assume necessarily that they died because they had caught the flu or pneumonia. So Sangamon County is a good example because I mentioned them earlier and I alluded to them because they're one of those counties that put out one of those gold star books where they took the time to put together a book of all of the soldiers who had perished and nurses who had perished during the war. And again, it's a preponderously high number of influenza victims. So when you're looking at these books, you see things like this. Isn't she beautiful? Geneva Devens, winds up dying of influenza. William dies of influenza, right? Not only in the military, but on the home front as well. They were so desperate for nurses and doctors that the Red Cross, which we mentioned earlier, the Red Cross actually sets up 2 temporary hospitals. They set one up in October to November to combat the first wave of the the second wave of the flu pandemic. Things kind of peter out a little bit towards Christmas time, and then it ramps up again. And the third wave, there's actually a third wave of the flu that crests into January through March of 1919. So twice they have to open emergency hospitals to handle the overflow from the Sangamon County Hospital, and they cared for an estimated 318 different patients. Of those already in the service, they had 30 people who died of the flu. So like I said, when you go through this Gold Star book, 30 of them have succumbed to the flu at that particular time. Camp Grant. Did any of you have family stationed at Camp Grant? What went on at Camp Grant is almost as horrifying as what went on at Camp Devens. So Commander Charles Hagedorn, he's new to the position, even though he's a career military man. He has been in the service for over 20 years. He is very decorated. He is very well respected. He arrives at Camp Grant in August 8th of 1918. He's approached by his men that there's overcrowding, that there's too many men who are stationed at Camp Grant. We need to do something about it. So how they had it set up was they had tents where they would put several hundred men in at a time. Well, Commander Hagedorn didn't like this. Winter was coming. You can all make jokes. Winter was coming. So he decided that he wanted to move them out of these tents and move them into the barracks. Well, by moving them into the barracks, he was creating overcrowding. It was his own fault. If he had left the men in the tents, they might have had better results. So what he does is he overrules his medical staff and decides that he's going to move the men into the barracks because he doesn't want them to be out in the cold over winter. So the first signs of the flu start to break in September 15th. Several officers arrive from Camp Devens. Camp Devens should have been under quarantine. Those men should have been locked down, and they weren't. There were 4 men who said that, we're important, we've got business at Camp Grant, we've got to get there. So they let them go, because at the time, they weren't showing any symptoms of having the flu. And the U.S. Army didn't start to quarantine people flat out until after this. If you had important business, and when you're in the military, it's all important business, right? They were letting people come back and forth, so it wasn't as tight of a lockdown as it should have been. So by September 15th, these 4 officers arrive in camp. By September 12th, or September 21st, that's when you see that spike at Camp Devens. So they're getting out just ahead of, that boom that occurs. They bring it right to Camp Grant. 108 cases. Shortly after these 4 men arrive from Camp Devens, 108 cases right at the start of it. More and more and more men are getting sick and coming into the hospital. We saw the result, 262 beds at Camp Grant, right? October 8th, the body count is still rising. You still have more and more men who are being brought into the hospital. It has not crested yet. And all the staff keeps saying something needs to be done about this. And Commander Hagedorn keeps saying, it's fine, it's crested, it's fine, it's crested. The worst of it is over. He commits suicide on October 8th, the same day that the 500th man dies at Camp Grant. He can't handle the stress of it. So what he does is he calls his officers into his office. He says, I want you to go stand outside at attention. I will be out shortly. So everybody clears the office. Everybody goes outside, and they're standing at attention, waiting and waiting. And 20 minutes goes by, and he doesn't appear. And 30 minutes goes by, and he doesn't appear. So one of the officers decides to break out of rank to go find out where he is. And they hear the report of the shot. He shoots himself in his office and commits suicide. It ran in lots of papers. Commander commits suicide, is horrified over the number of statistics, over the number of men that he's losing. Again, remember I told you they had the 5 different papers in Rockford. You get a different piece, a different part of that account that comes from all the different papers in Rockford. But they talk about what a wonderful man he was. He just misjudged. He just underestimated. So he was just one example. And the death toll continues to rise. With his suicide or not, the death toll at Camp Grant continues to rise. It was one of the most heavily impacted Army bases. So Camp Grant, Camp Devens, Camp Funston, 3 of the hardest hit military bases in the U.S. 45,000 men are stationed there. I mean, it was overcrowded to begin with because the original camp was only designed to hold 25,000. So they already had 20,000 more men than they needed at the time. 12,000 soldiers and staff caught the flu. Almost 1,100 died. That is a staggering number. So 500 more people die after Commander Hagedorn takes his own life, throughout the month of October. Now, what about Great Lakes? Great Lakes is a very interesting account because Great Lakes intentionally lowballed their numbers. And they did this because they wanted to protect the integrity of the Navy. They didn't want people to know that they were in serious distress. So the first group of men that start to report to the base on September 8th, they come to the hospital with flu-like symptoms. But remember what I said, those first cases were misdiagnosed as spinal meningitis. So they're reading these reports and they're thinking, oh, well, we're going to treat them as if they have spinal meningitis. So they're giving them the wrong treatment. So those first men who walk in the door are automatically assumed that they have meningitis. So luckily for their camp commander, they acted quickly. But he acted quickly in the wrong regards. So while he moves quickly, he refuses liberty, doesn't let anybody leave the base. He's quarantined everybody to their barracks. They're not allowed to be out in public. You have 1,000 symptomatic men. You have 1,000 men who are starting to appear like they're sick. They're not sick yet. They're just symptomatic, or they have the possibility of being symptomatic because of people they've come in contact with, or they were recently on leave somewhere where there might have been the flu outbreak. So he does the right thing by clamping down right away. He gives every man in the camp a throat spray every day. So every day, all 50,000 of them have to parade by the nurses and get a throat spray. Did it work? We know that the throat sprays didn't work, right? We know that now. They didn't know that at the time. He thought, I'm on the ball, I'm doing the right thing, and he did by quarantining the base. But at the same time, he didn't provide the right treatment in order to deal with the sheer numbers of fatalities he was going to have on his hands in very short order. So the total registered flu cases on September 26 was 8,475. They had over 200 of them just the day before. So how accurate do you think this number is? It's not terribly accurate, right? Because he's keeping his numbers low so that they don't know exactly how bad it is. Men are dying at an alarming rate. All across the country, it's an alarming rate. Great Lakes buys up all of the winding sheets that they can get from the city of Chicago. If you don't know what a winding sheet, this is a winding sheet. Right? They're bags. They're sheets to put the bodies in because they know what's coming. They've seen what happened at Camp Grant. They've seen what's happened at Camp Devens. They're trying to be proactive. We know this is going to happen. As the flu outbreak begins to wear on, the morgues stack to capacity. Ambulances are leaving around the clock. And an ambulance could usually take 2 people at a time, right, when they're alive and they're healthy. Well, when they're dead, they're stacking them up, right, 2 or 3 high on either side. And they're pushing them to the Great Lakes train station because they're trying to get them back to where they belong, right? They can't keep up. They're putting people in bags before they even die, just to be ready for it, right? So the number of beds that they have and the number of people who are sick, we know doesn't add up. So there's a report, and I'll read it to you in a second, about how, they had people waiting. They had people on the floor, and as soon as this guy died, they put him in the bed, in a sheet, but I'm not dead. It reminds me of the old Monty Python skit. But I'm not dead. Yes, you are. It's that kind of scenario, which is horrifying. It's a very defeatist attitude when you think about it. So here's a quote from a nurse who was stationed there at the time. So Josie Mabel Brown, who lived to be 100 years old, rest her soul, She's quoted as saying, the boys were brought in and we would put winding sheets on them, even if they weren't dead. You would always leave the left big toe exposed so that you could put the body tag on it. You would have the boy's name, his rank, his next of kin, so they could ship the body back to Chicago or wherever it needed to go. As one boy lay dying in the bed, there was another one laying on the floor waiting to take his space. Each morning, as the ambulance drivers would bring in more sick boys, they would carry the dead out with them. The morgue was stacked to capacity, to the ceiling with bodies, because the casket makers could not make boxes fast enough. Josie often said she felt sorry for the poor boy who was on the bottom, right? Because if you're stacked 10 high, right, the poor boy who's on the bottom. Just let that sink in for a second. Josie survived. She did not become sick, but several other nurses at Great Lakes did become sick and did die of the influenza. And that was the one thing that was accurately reported about what was going on at Great Lakes. So the U.S. Navy Surgeon General's report every year would report on medical preparedness and disease each year in the Army. And they said that during the widespread epidemic of influenza, the following named nurses died who had contracted this disease during the line of duty, and it lists the names of the nurses who had perished. So they accurately reported the names of the nurses who died, and they intentionally misreported the names of everybody else who had died. So that brings me to Cook County. We have somebody in the audience who has heard me lament my frustration with Cook County when it came to the flu epidemic. So Cook County had a public health commissioner whose name was John Dill Robertson, and you see his picture right here. Looks like an upstanding, reliable guy, doesn't he? By the end of this, I cannot have anything but the utmost disrespect for John Robertson. And I know not everybody agrees with that assessment, but if any of you remember during the first Gulf War and they talk about, Baghdad Bob, there are no bombs being dropped behind us as you're seeing all of the, the bombs crashing on the ground behind him. That is how I look at John Robertson. He's telling everybody, there's nothing to see here. Don't look at the wizard behind the curtain. Everything is fine. And he's intentionally trying to keep people calm. And he's proud of himself that he is lying to the public about how bad the epidemic really is. So we see a marked uptick in September 21st of flu reports that are coming into Cook County Hospital and are coming into other hospitals like Presbyterian Hospital in the Chicagoland area. On September 23rd, he says, we've got this thing licked. Everything is fine. Don't worry about it. There's no problem at all. By September 30th, there are 260 verified cases. That's what's being reported, 260. Do we think we have the situation well in hand? Oh, it gets worse from there. It gets much, much worse from there. So Commissioner Robertson fails to take action repeatedly fails to take action because he doesn't want to panic people. So it's not until October 1st that he agrees to start quarantining people who are symptomatic. So if you look like you're coughing and your nose is running, we're going to quarantine you, but nobody else. Well, you remember what I said earlier about how from the moment you start looking sick, within, 48 hours you're dead, right? So, if he's waiting until they actually visibly see somebody sick, they've missed the opportunity to protect their populace. So by October 1st, he says, okay, we're going to quarantine those who are symptomatic. Within that week alone, over 40,000 people become sick with the flu. He proclaims, backbone is broken, we've reached the crest, everything is fine. Once again, there's no bombs behind me, everything is perfectly fine, everything looks wonderful. By October 8th, he waits until October 8th to close theaters and entertainment centers, but he only closes the rich, the high-end centers. The expensive movie theaters and the Broadway, the off-Broadway theaters downtown, right? He doesn't close the bowling alleys or the pool halls or the saloons where the poor people are congregating. He's only trying to protect the rich at this particular point in time. But if you claim the week of October 1st that the backbone is broken, why are you closing centers on October 8th? His actions and his words are not matching up. So at this point, newspaper articles are running in the Chicago Tribune and in the Chicago Inter-Ocean and in the Daily News saying, half of the nation is going to come down with this. We need to do something. And he's ignoring all of that. So John Robertson refuses to curtail the general public from being able to meet. They're still going to billiards halls, they're still going to bars, they're still congregating in the streets. And he is quoted as saying, publicly, nothing was done to interfere with the morale of the community. I didn't want to frighten anybody. I don't think very highly of John Robertson. What frustrates me even more, this one, you got to see this one. Influenza and pneumonia. We're going to close down theaters. We're going to make sure that we're keeping you safe. This theater has agreed to cooperate with the Department of Health in disseminating the truth about influenza and thus serve a great educational purpose. Was he serving a great educational purpose? So when he made the announcement to close the theaters, he's quoted as saying, you know, what are these theater girls going to do? If we close, they're not making any money. They're going to live. That's what they're going to do. They're going to live. They're going to survive the pandemic. He didn't care about that. He was so worried about looking bad that he didn't act fast enough. They did not curtail public activities for everybody until October 16th, a full week after he makes his announcement. Right? The Chicago Tribune and other papers are reporting that you've got 1,200 cases a day that are being reported. And he waits 2-3 weeks before he acts. Within the poorer neighborhoods, these numbers are staggering. They are way higher than what you're seeing in affluent and well-to-do North Shore communities. And the reason for that is because a lot of them didn't speak English, so they're not reading newspapers. There's a lot of disinformation going on in newspaper accounts. Like you'll see headlines that'll say, eat more onions. That'll fight off the flu. No, it'll just make people not want to come near you, which I guess might be the case, really, when you think about it. So there's a lot of, try this Dr. Brown's elixir, right? You've read old newspapers, you've seen these ads. So there's misinformation going on, and you have a high population of poor immigrant people who don't speak English and aren't reading the local paper. So they're still continuing to go about their daily business. They have to go to work or their family doesn't eat. You know, they put themselves out there every day to continue to drive, you know, the wagons and as Teamsters and as railroad employees so that the city still runs. They're dying at staggering rates. So Cook County Hospital, which I'll show you a manifest from Cook County Hospital, has one of the highest mortality rates in the entire country. It's serving poorer communities, right? You're getting a lot of ethnic immigrants who are coming into Cook County Hospital because they can't afford to go to the more higher end Catholic and Presbyterian hospitals, right? Their mortality rate is almost 40%. Almost 1 in 2, almost every other person who walks into that hospital is not coming out alive. That is a staggering number. Even when you look at 1,200 people a day coming ill, even when you hear about 800 people dying in a single day, 40% is unheard of. So here's one of the cropping. I tried to enlarge it as best I could for you. This is a Cook County admissions book, which are available from NEIU. You can go down and look at the original manifests. And it's just the intake record. So it's 2 pages. It's going to list the name of the person who's coming in. It's going to list who brought them, their next of kin, what their ailments are, and then what happens. Are they discharged? You know, do they die? What's their diagnosis? And just look at these. And there's page after page after page of these. And they're telling you, you know, in this particular case, that what wards they were sent to, recovered, died, improved, death, you know, recovered. And they're telling you what happens to these people. So you can look at these original books. They have them at Cook County Hospital, or for Cook County Hospital. That's just a small portion. Here's one of the full pages. I mean, just look at this page. You know, if you're lucky enough to come in because you're having a baby, congratulations. But everybody else who's coming in is because they're dying of influenza or bronchitis associated with influenza. I mean, these reports are amazing. And then the Cook County Health Department put out a report the following year that lists the numbers, the speculated numbers, because they don't have a full count of the number of people who in Cook County became sick with the flu. So here's the one for Illinois. This is the second annual report because the state didn't start keeping them until 1918. And by county, the number of people, right, who are coming down with the communicable disease. So it gives you all the different types of things that people could have caught. So a lot of people, in Chicago caught diphtheria as well. But those are the number of people who were documented as having the flu. We know that number is way low, but they're still reporting 43,000. You're still looking at some of these smaller counties, 618, DeKalb County, 683. Those are still really high numbers for small rural farms and communities. I talked about how people in Chicago who were in the poorer, more immigrant communities were succumbing to the disease at a higher rate. Here's a heat map to kind of show you that. This young lady did a thesis that was released in November of 2016. And she's kind of giving you a heat map of the mortality rates based on the flu in the city of Chicago. So there are communities that are hit particularly hard. Pullman, the Pullman district, is hit particularly hard with a huge number of deaths. You've got a lot of people in the Cragen and Belmont area who are coming sick. That's where my Italian and my Polish sides of the families were living. They were living on the west side. And you just see a huge number of people who are getting sick in the poorer communities. You look on the North Shore, the numbers are much lower, because they can afford doctors. They're not as crammed in as the people who are living in the tenements, and they have access to better care. So what are the after effects? What happens once it crests and it starts to ease down? I said you had that third wave, that final wave of influenza in January of 1919. While it still had a mortality rate, it was back in line with that 0.7% that any typical flu year would have. So while it was hot on the heels of the epidemic, the numbers were still in line with what you would see. There was an outbreak again in 1920 and 1921. There was an outbreak again in 1927 and 1928. And you see those numbers return to normal, if you want to call it normal. The global estimate is anywhere from 20 to 100 million. That's like me just throwing a dart and hoping to hit something. Think of that. That is a widely disparate number. It could have been between 20 million and 100 million. The estimates are starting to fall. The current estimates are starting to fall between 48 million and 60 million. That's the global estimate for the number of people that you're seeing from reports now in the 21st century. 25 to 30% of Americans contracted the virus between 1918 and 1919. So if you count the 36 of us that are in the room, right, a third of us are going to contract the flu and may survive or may not survive. There's an estimate globally that 650,000 people died of the flu. They said that number could actually be as high as 1.2 million, but the general estimate now is about 680,000 people succumbing to the disease. In the end, 43,000 soldiers lose their lives to the influenza outbreak. So when you have 4 million soldiers who serve, and you have roughly 108,000 men who are listed as casualties of the war, almost half of them are listed as dying of pneumonia or the flu as a report of their illnesses. And there's a lot of newspaper reports that come out after that, the total of influenza. So they went and ranked the 26 biggest cities and their death toll. They went and did the 50 biggest cities and their death tolls. So between the 46 largest cities in America, they're saying 111,000 people. The Journal of American Medicine predates, goes all the way back to the First World War. They're talking about the outbreaks within the camps. Here's Camp Devens. You had 13,000 cases reported, right? And your total deaths were 794. Here's Camp Grant, right? 10,000 cases, so 10% of those men perished. But down here, right? You look at Fort Sherman, right? Half the numbers that you're seeing in some of these larger camps, right? 4,000 men become sick, but almost half of them die. So you see that it says that you've got 4,700 men who contracted the disease, and 1,700 of them, total deaths are 1,000. That's a huge number. I mean, it's a huge number for a small camp or a small base. Several doctors and scientists have spent their entire careers trying to figure out exactly what happened. How did this get so bad so fast. So doctors like Jeffrey Tonnenberg, who I gave you the link to before, Paul Lewis, he's one of those people that went into the lab and didn't come out for a year during the pandemic outbreak, spent the rest of his life into the 1930s trying to figure out exactly what happened. Richard Shope in the 50s, Alfred Crosby. These guys spent their entire lives going to their graves, not necessarily having an answer. But what evidence is starting to show is that it wasn't just a human flu and a swine flu, which is what they originally estimated. You've got those pigs who are getting sick in Haskell, Kansas. It was a combination of 3 different flu viruses. You had the swine flu, you had the human flu, and you had the avian flu. Well, we've heard about the avian flu, right? About what's happening in Asia, what's going on in China and other parts of Asia. What they think happened in Europe is that all 3 of those things mixed at once, because you had a lot of Asian supply centers where they were the ones that were in the back, behind the lines, who were supplying the materials, who were supplying, the food, and who were driving the vehicles and making sure that the trains were arriving on time. And they think that their flu combined with our flu and created that antigen shift. So if you've ever read Alfred Crosby's book, there are several good books I would recommend. So you have John M. Barry's book called The Great Influenza. You have Carol Byersley's book about the U.S. Army during the First World War. It's called Fever of War. Gina Colada put out a book, and I think Deb has it upstairs here in her library, just called Flu. It's about the pandemic, right? And then you have Alfred Crosby's book. And they talk about it, and Gina talks about how you have people like Alfred who, are going to these places where flu victims are buried, digging up those bodies and taking samples so that they can figure out exactly what happened, what caused this. So, they talk about going up above the permafrost because those bodies are going to be the most intact. So in Alaska and in Norway and in Siberia, and digging through the permafrost with jackhammers to get at these bodies and actually taking garden shears and stuff and cutting off ribs so they can bring them back and analyze them to figure out exactly what happened. So through those heroic efforts, this is what they believe the cause was, that you had the human flu combined with the swine flu, combining with the avian flu to cause this once in a lifetime, once in a century, hopefully once in a millennial outbreak of the flu pandemic. But they're always worried that you're going to see that come back again. So any questions? I apologize for running over a little. Yeah, please.
I wanted to know how we got the name Spanish influenza.
That's a good question.
That is a good question. Because they actually think that in Europe, they kind of blame the Spaniards. They kind of said, well, you were the first people who were showing signs of having this disease, so it must be your fault. So that's kind of back to that jingoistic notion of blaming someone else, because you can't blame a pig, I guess, really. So they were coming out and saying, well, it had to have been the Spaniards because they were the ones that were, the first ones to report being ill.
So that they were the real antigen shift.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Now that you're all freaked out, like with flu season quickly approaching. Now every time somebody sneezes, you're going to be like, yeah, winter's coming.
Isn't it true that more men died from the flu during the war than from bad?
Well, not necessarily, because the average is about 108,000 soldiers were reported as being, killed or wounded. So that number is staggeringly high, but it might not necessarily be greater than. So it depends on the reports you look at. Some people will say, yes, it was higher. Yes, more people came down with the flu than any other type of casualty, but a lot of men did recover. So death and coming down with it, the numbers can be skewed.
Just have one other question. Are the statistics only including the influenza, or do they include the influenza and the pneumonia?
It depends. It depends. They didn't always report them as the same thing. Sometimes they would report any type of bronchial infection. So if you caught bronchitis and died, they'd roll it all into one. Some of them segmented it out. So influenza was one thing and bronchial pneumonia was something different. It just depends on the state, and it depends on the county. It depends on the base, how they wanted to report it. So they tried to categorize them separately, but as you saw, one went right into the other. Exactly. So it was too hard to separate out what the cause was. So when you look at those records, like Will County's recorders of deeds or death records, you know, even if it says pneumonia and doesn't say influenza, or it says bronchial distress, it was most likely the complication from that, because it weakened your immune system so quickly that this pneumonia was able to set in really quickly. So when they talk about men turning blue, that was their sign that it had gone from a straight influenza case to being the bronchial pneumonia influenza, because as soon as you turn blue, your body's not getting enough oxygen, and that's when they're starting to realize that they're getting those bursts, the blood vessels are bursting in their lungs. And as soon as you started to change color, you were done. You were done. It was just a matter of time. So they report them together, they report them separately. It just depends on what they felt like that day. Anybody else?
Yeah, there's just a comment.
Don't I sound wonderful?
Yeah, there's just a comment about how the Spaniards were neutral, and some really, really good comments online through our questions. But no, just so far, no questions online.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.